We have liftoff.
Conquering space is a magnificent achievement.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It is the only time that any nation has been able to rally around a national commitment of so much significance.
But it has come at great cost. Rocketry is dangerous.
You're literally purposely setting something that is naturally combustible on fire and trying to constrain it to get thrust.
In our pursuit of the stars, astronauts have burned to death during tests. They have perished upon launch.
All of a sudden, there's just this huge explosion. They did not die until they impacted the water.
They have been stranded 330,000 kilometers from Earth.
Okay, we've had a problem here.
And astronauts have died, returning home. Mankind's exploration of space has typified our species' ingenuity and resilience. But our journey has been plagued by mishap, disaster, and death. Around the world, humanity exists only moments from catastrophe. Disaster bubbles below the surface of the Earth, strikes from the heavens, or engulfs us from the sea. But we are not merely at the mercy of our planet. In our pursuit of industry, global connectivity, and reach for the stars, lives have been lost. Disasters reveal the best and worst of mankind, as one tragedy compounds another. How do these disasters occur? And what lessons can equip us when catastrophe strikes again? NASA's Apollo program is an extraordinary achievement. It brought space to the people.
We have liftoff.
The target was the moon. And it wasn't an abstract target, it was something people can come see with their eyes. The idea that there would be someone like you walking around this thing, I think really captured the imagination.
And when Neil put his boot on the moon, the entire world placed that footprint on the moon, not just Neil.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And those first moments, blew me away as a kid. But as an adult, you look back and you think, how did they achieve all that? So many things had to go right, and they were using 1960s technology.
It is the only time that any nation has been able to rally around a national commitment of so much significance.
It captured the essence and the best of humanity, and that it's discovery and cooperation.
Although NASA had experienced tragedy and death behind the scenes, the enormous success of Apollo 11 lulled the general public into complacency about the dangers of space travel. That perception would be shattered only 9 months later with Apollo 13. Preparations for the mission were just like the others, moon trips having become almost routine. The two previous trips, Apollos 11 and 12, successfully carried Americans to the moon. Apollo 13's objective was to explore new lunar territory, the Fra Moreau region, home to a large meteorite crater. The three quietly excited explorers were astronauts James Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. Two days into the mission, and 330,000 kilometers from Earth, disaster struck as an oxygen tank exploded aboard the service module.
Apollo 13 was
When you're out in space, a couple of days from Earth, the last thing you want to hear is a bang. And that's what they heard.
With the clock ticking, NASA scrambled to bring Apollo 13 home safely, under the most trying circumstances they had ever faced.
It's one of the most extraordinary stories of rescue.
Both the launch and retrieval of Apollo 13 would require hard lessons learned from previous missions.
Apollo 13 is NASA's most successful failure.
It wouldn't be the first or last time that mankind would face peril in an effort to journey from the Earth. Space disasters have occurred at every stage of the technology's development.
Are you declaring an emergency, sir?
Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
There's no greater contrast than the horror of war and the nobility of reaching for the stars. Yet the roots of space exploration lie in the Second World War. Germany achieved major strides in space exploration technology in the form of the V1 and V2 rockets that filled the skies of London with terror.
We wanted to understand more about that technology that they had developed with the V2 and the V1.
As the Second World War came to a close and the Iron Curtain was drawn, both the United States and Soviet Union each clamored for technological superiority. Both East and West snatched up German scientists and engineers, initiating tit-for-tat ballistic weapons programs that would determine the world's most powerful nation. But as the Cold War heated up, each side turned their gaze to the stars in a pursuit that would encapsulate dominance: the space race.
When you have competition, when you have race, that's when great things happen. World records and Olympic records are never set by the person running down the street. They're set at the Olympics, where you have the best and strongest and fastest and brightest competing all at once.
But the race was fraught with danger and mistakes as each nation pushed toward a moving finish line. First off the starting block, the Soviets. On October 4th, 1957, they astonished the world by launching the first satellite ever into orbit, Sputnik 1.
You would go outside just to see the spy satellite that was flying over. We weren't sure what this technology was doing. It was certainly more advanced than anything we had here in the United States.
The US needed to move into a sprint, establishing NASA in 1958. They set a landmark target to put the very first person into space. It was a bold goal.
First of all, the challenge of putting a man into space was not easy. It was very, very difficult. We had to understand how to safely launch a human being from the ground into space and orbit the planet.
NASA began Project Mercury with 7 astronauts known as the Mercury 7. But in 1961, the Soviets beat the Americans to the post. On April 12th, just after his 27th birthday, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to enter space and orbit the Earth.
He only did one orbit, I guess, and came back, but he was up there.
Gagarin's feat was backed by weapons technology. The Vostok rocket that projected the cosmonaut into orbit was derived from the Soviet R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. But the Soviet track record with early ICBMs was far from clean. Less than a year before Gagarin's flight, a prototype missile malfunctioned on the launch pad. At least 100 people were killed in the blast, and as many injured. But this did not deter the Soviets from pursuing the technology. America's space program ran parallel to Russia's, with Project Mercury employing the United States' first intercontinental ballistic missile, the Atlas, to achieve the dream of space. Designed to deliver a nuclear warhead, the Atlas was repurposed with the intent to carry a human being. Tests soon began, with primate pilots. But the Americans suffered their own setbacks. On the 20th of February, 1962, astronaut John Glenn bravely took his place inside Friendship 7, the same missile that had exploded during tests only 3 months earlier. Glenn orbited Earth, rocketing through space at a blistering 28,000 kilometers per hour.
It was only when John Glenn got up there and did 3 orbits to the Earth that the Americans kind of caught up.
The Americans had achieved orbit, but were still lagging behind the Soviets. The US needed a new target. So began the Apollo missions.
The goal really was set by President Kennedy, and Apollo's goal was to get people to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Apollo 1 was to be the first flight of NASA's lunar program. However, it wouldn't go to the moon. It would just orbit Earth, conducting a series of trials. A week before the launch, there was a full test run on the launch pad.
The test was a plugs-out test. We wanted to see if the spacecraft would operate successfully and properly under its own power. So normally when you would have a spacecraft in the launch complex, you would be feeding it power from the ground stands and the ground support equipment. But this was a simulation. It was a simulation just as though you were getting ready for a launch.
On January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee boarded the Apollo 1 command module. But problems began almost immediately. The communications were phasing in and out. Indeed, they were so bad, Grissom commented on them.
But how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?
It was kind of a premonition of what was to come.
Tragedy struck at 6:30 in the morning when a massive fire broke out in the capsule. The fire killed all 3 astronauts within just 90 seconds. Six days after the disaster, NASA set up a review board to investigate the tragic beginnings of the Apollo program.
This was an unfueled attempt. They really wanted to make sure that the capsule itself, the Apollo, kind of almost a dry test run. And that's actually what led to its untimely disaster. The fact that it wasn't a full test, they didn't treat it as a full test. They didn't take the proper safety precautions. They didn't do the proper protocols.
The investigation quickly determined that a major contributing factor to the fire was the atmosphere inside the capsule.
We were operating in a 100% oxygen atmosphere. That should have been a major flag to all members of the program. This was a significantly hazardous test.
Once the astronauts were sealed inside the capsule, it was filled with pure oxygen and pressurized to be 15% higher than the atmosphere outside. The purpose was to expel nitrogen, preventing the astronauts getting the bends.
The bends can be a problem in space.
Just as if you go scuba diving, you get more pressure the further you go. The higher up you keep going into space, the less pressure you get.
When a person experiences a rapid decrease in pressure, bubbles of nitrogen gas can form in the body, causing the bends. This decompression sickness is painful, even deadly, but the risk can be eliminated by getting rid of the nitrogen and breathing pure oxygen. During the test, the pure oxygen environment was exposed to a stray spark, presumably fired from faulty wiring near Grissom's seat.
Now, one of the fallacies that people have frequently is that, oh my God, oxygen burns. Oxygen does not burn. Oxygen supports combustion. The critical issue here was that materials that normally would burn at room temperature are just inflamed and consumed very dramatically with 100% atmosphere.
The investigation discovered that a range of inappropriate materials inside the cabin were compromised by the excess oxygen.
The two most notable materials were the spacesuits. They were made out of nylon, very flammable material. And 100% oxygen in the atmosphere is even worse.
A quarter of White's spacesuit had simply melted away.
And then we have Velcro.
There were 3 square meters of the nylon-based Velcro on board.
It wouldn't have taken much in terms of a short circuit for just one little spark to just ignite the cabin instantly.
Oxygen and flammable materials weren't the only culprits in the accident. Another problem was the capsule's hatch.
Because it was pressurized inside and the door was inward opening, it was very hard to open the door.
The pressure inside the capsule, 15% higher than that outside, pushed outward at the walls of the craft.
In order to pull that hatch open, you had to overcome that resistance. So basically it was like opening a bottle that's got a suction on it.
So the astronauts would have trouble opening the door. The rescuers on the other side would have trouble opening the door against the pressure.
The inquiry determined Grissom had tried to open the hatch, but to no avail. The Apollo 1 astronauts knew what they'd volunteered for, and fittingly, a plaque that tributes them reads, Ad Astra per Aspera, a rough road to the stars.
The astronauts who signed up, most of them had been fighter pilots, so it either served in World War II or even in later conflicts in Korea. And they were mostly test pilots, so they were used to doing more experimental things that have a higher risk. And so they had a mentality that they knew what they were doing was genuinely risky, but it was ultimately a lofty goal.
NASA did learn a great deal from the tragedy, ensuring the deaths were not in vain. The flammable nylon suits were redesigned for future missions. The pure oxygen environment in the capsule at launch was also abandoned. Instead, the astronauts just breathed oxygen in their suits. NASA also only constructed outward opening doors from that point forward.
One of the outcomes of Apollo 1 was that NASA really said, hey, we have to do complete protocols. We need to make sure this is safe. We need to take every precaution, list every sort of hazard, and make sure this is done properly.
I still maintain that had Apollo 1 not happened, fire could have happened later in the program, and it would have been the end of the program if it had happened on the way to the moon.
April 11th, 1970. Preparations for Apollo 13's own rough road to the stars were underway. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert would attempt one of the most dangerous endeavors our species ever has, using some of the most dangerous equipment we have invented. All the Apollo missions required pushing an enormous amount of weight beyond Earth's gravitational pull. A new type of rocket had to be built for the program. The monstrous Saturn V.
Once they decided to go to the moon, they had to, they were taking 3 astronauts. They were taking a lot of equipment. So they had to develop these enormous rockets.
It was powerful, 5 engines, had the lift capacity for the Apollo Command and Service Module, plus the Lunar Excursion Modules.
The Command and Service Module, or CSM, was where the crew would spend the majority of their time on the voyage. The Cylindrical Service Module would provide propulsion and electrical power systems for the Command Module, which was where the crew's cabin was located. The Command Module doubled as the re-entry vehicle for getting the crew back to Earth. The Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM, would transport the crew to and from the Moon's surface, rendezvousing with the orbiting CSM for the return journey. The tremendous weight of the components required an incredibly powerful launch vehicle.
Saturn V was the largest launch vehicle that we had ever built. It was an incredible machine.
They're over 100 meters long. You imagine a 100-meter run, how far, and that's just straight up. And when full of fuel, they weigh something like 3,000 tons. That's 1,500 large cars, all of it lifting off the ground against gravity.
The vast majority of the Saturn V's 100 meters was full of liquid hydrogen and oxygen. When mixed together, they created an explosive reaction.
You're literally purposely setting something that is naturally combustible on fire and trying to constrain it to get thrust. So you're creating thousands and thousands of mini explosions on board hundreds of thousands of kilograms of fuel source.
Taming these volatile substances was one of NASA's greatest achievements.
11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3.
The engine's firing. You have this tremendous vibration. The tremendous impact of the shock wave and the sound and the roar that's delayed. You see the flash, and then a few seconds later you feel the pressure wave and you hear the sound, and it's just deafening.
Control Houston, we appear to have a good first stage at this point.
The Saturn V still holds the record for lifting the heaviest payload and remains the only rocket to have taken humans beyond low Earth orbit. Apollo 13's dangerous launch proceeded to plan, but disaster was only days away. The Apollo missions were revolutionary, but to truly transition into the space age, spacecraft needed to be reusable. And that was the purpose of the shuttle program.
It was envisaged that eventually it would be used in an aircraft-like way, that it would take off, operate in space, come back and land, and after a few days could be refueled, refurbished, and take off again. And of course, it never ended up being like that.
One of the reasons was that space shuttle launches were expensive. The program averaged out at about $1.5 billion per takeoff. Still, 5 different shuttles flew a total of 134 missions.
The Space Shuttle program was a fantastic program. People criticised it because it wasn't going very far. They were always in low Earth orbit. But that is space, and they were doing some interesting things.
In an attempt to reignite the public's interest in the shuttle program, on January 28, 1986, Challenger was going to transport the US's first civilian into space.
Today I'm directing NASA to begin a search in all of our elementary and secondary schools and to choose as the first citizen passenger in the history of our space program, one of America's finest, a teacher.
After a nationwide search and 11,000 applications, 114 teachers were shortlisted, with 10 finalists being put through their paces at the Johnson Space Center.
NASA has always been about striving for education and inspiration. What better way to inspire the next generation of scientists to have a teacher do their own experiments?
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Or is that you?
Here we were taking a citizen, a teacher, who was actually going to conduct lessons from space.
I mean, the whole thing is so gorgeous. You just want to bring it all back into the classroom for the kids.
There hadn't been so much interest in a launch for a long time. It was important things went right. But problems began the day before launch.
Launch control at T-minus 20 minutes and holding.
There was a cold spell that came in, weather front, and we had some of the lowest temperatures they've ever seen in Florida at the Cape, at the launch pad. It was actually causing freezing, causing icicles to form.
We're in a unscheduled hold to determine what action should be taken about ice.
Despite concerns expressed by some of the engineers, the decision was made to launch that vehicle.
Because this was a teacher, it was showed in a lot of schools and a lot of classrooms,
including McAuliffe's own classroom.
People have estimated 17% of the entire US population was watching the single liftoff.
Among the dignitaries and journalists that gathered to see the launch at Cape Canaveral was McAuliffe's mother.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
And then all of a sudden, off the side of one of the solid rocket boosters, there's this plasma jet of flame. Now, if you're an engineer, you know that. That's a problem.
The space shuttle program had suffered its first real disaster. Three days later, a memorial service at Johnson Space Center was attended by almost 10,000 people, and President Reagan spoke in honor of the deceased.
Sometimes when we reach for the stars, we fall short, but we must pick ourselves up again and press on, despite the pain.
I think, what played on everyone's mind then was, it exploded just 73 seconds after launch. How long did those astronauts live for? What did they see? What did they witness in the end? It's a horrible thought.
The inquiry into the Challenger disaster would attempt to answer some of those questions. But first they had to figure out what went wrong. It was revealed that the cold weather had been critical.
The problem with the space shuttle is that in some ways it was too successful. It was really only ever an experimental vehicle. What we think of as the space shuttle was actually a combination of a launch system that consisted of the orbiter vehicle, which is the winged vehicle that sat attached to the external tank, to which the two very large solid-fueled rocket engines that would be reusable.
After launch, the solid rocket boosters would detach and parachute back to Earth, where they would be collected, refurbished, and reused. To assist the refurbishing process, the rockets were not one solid case.
They were actually made in sections that were joined together and were sealed by what were called field joints.
The field joints were covered with large rubber O-rings. These O-rings were not graded to operate in the temperatures experienced at Cape Canaveral, and one had given way. Unable to contain the explosive reactions within the rocket booster, the field joint began spewing hot plasma, leading to a catastrophic failure of the whole launch system. Disturbingly, the inquiry revealed that at least some of the 7 crew survived the initial explosion.
We had designed the spacecraft so that the crew module was a separate pressure container inside the fuselage of the orbiter vehicle. So when it detonated and exploded and ruptured, you see this small object separating out of the fireball. Well, what that object was the crew module.
There is evidence that at least, I think, 2 of the occupants turned on systems, oxygen systems on board.
They did not die until they impacted the water.
It was a very dark chapter in NASA's history book. It would take the best part of 3 years before another shuttle would launch. April 13th, 1970. Another form of darkness had swallowed the Apollo 13 mission. Having revolved around the Earth, using its gravity to slingshot toward the moon, the crew was sailing through space 2 days from home. Up to that point, the smooth journey was on track to being the Apollo program's most uneventful mission, prompting the capsule communicator at Mission Control to say, "We're bored to tears down here." But that evening, disaster struck.
When you're out in space, a couple of days from Earth, the last thing you want to hear, I'm guessing, is a bang.
They described it as a jarring or bump to the spacecraft.
You gotta remember, in space, there's no sound. You're in a vacuum. And so the only sound would be what would be transmitted through the hardware in the spacecraft.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
A short circuit inside one of the 2 oxygen tanks on the service module had ignited.
One of the oxygen tanks on board had a heater in it. It detonated and completely blew out section 4 of the service module.
We are vetting something out into
The instruments indicated oxygen tank 2 was completely empty, and tank 1 was at half capacity. Power systems were damaged, water had been lost, and the Apollo 13 service module, which housed the crew, would be out of air in 3 hours. The mission was aborted and a new course plotted. Apollo 13 would slingshot around the moon, losing radio contact before returning to Earth. Although this shaved crucial time off the return journey, it would still take 3.5 days. In the emptiness between the Earth and Moon, NASA's first tragedy in space loomed.
Here is a bulletin from ABC News. The Apollo 13 spacecraft has had a serious power supply malfunction that could cause the lunar landing mission to be terminated early.
Because of Apollo 1 and the disasters, they wanted to figure out as many things that could go wrong as possible. So for every Apollo mission, they would have a scenario where they would say what can go wrong, and then they would fix it. They'd actually run what's called the lifeboat scenario for Apollo 8.
In the event of a catastrophic failure of the service module, the lifeboat scenario required the crew to transfer to the lunar module. The problem was, the lunar module was designed to house 2 astronauts for only 48 hours. Would it have enough oxygen, power, and water to allow the crew to survive for 4 days? NASA's Army of Engineers, assisted by Apollo 8's crew, began simulating the trip. The problem with losing oxygen was twofold. Vital to the astronauts' life support, the oxygen was also used by the fuel cells to generate power for the re-entry systems.
They'd lost oxygen. They couldn't use their fuel cells to recharge the batteries in the command module. So they thought, well, we've got to come back. We've got to make the re-entry in the command module. So we better preserve the battery power. So they did that by moving out of the command module into the lunar module.
There was sufficient oxygen on board for the crew members, but it had to be treated. There was a lithium hydroxide canister that actually processed carbon dioxide out of the air to make it breathable.
The lunar module had some canisters, but not enough to prevent the astronauts suffocating. Canisters would have to be repurposed from the service module, but this wasn't a straightforward process.
Well, this was a classic case of the canisters on the lunar module design were a different shape than the ones that we had in the Apollo. And so literally we had a round canister and a square canister, and how do you mate the two of these together? With just materials available to them, how could they solve this problem? And it was a case of going around and finding, what have you got? Well, we got a roll of tape over here, we got some Velcro over there, we've got some glue over here. But this is what engineers do. Engineers are problem solvers.
Relaying instructions to the Apollo 13 crew, NASA's engineers walked them through the construction of the makeshift system.
And no one panics. You can even hear the transcripts, and there's this calm, and this is what we have to do.
This is where a lot of the training that they had been given earlier became critical. And not just the training as crew members for the hardware, but a lot of them were actually part of our design team.
With 15 minutes of oxygen left in the service module, the repairs were completed, and the crew moved into the lunar module.
Most people quote that the accident and the disaster of Apollo 13 couldn't have happened at a better time. And the reason you say that is they were just far away enough from the Earth that they still had most of their supplies, but they hadn't gone to the moon. So if they had gone to the moon and come back and then the disaster had taken place, Apollo 13 doesn't have the lunar module. It's on the moon. They have no lifeboat.
But it would be days before the crew was scheduled to return home, in which time they had to travel further than any human had traveled before, losing contact with the Earth as they crossed behind the moon. And all that stood between them and the vacuum was a hastily patched craft. By the turn of the millennium, NASA's space dreams were well and truly back on track. The shuttle program had recovered from the Challenger disaster 14 years earlier, and with world partners, NASA was building an enormous laboratory in orbit, the International Space Station. Both the ISS and shuttle program would serve as platforms to conduct research in microgravity across a variety of fields. The crew that launched aboard Columbia on January 16, 2003, embarked upon a 2-week mission of research and education.
Zero G baseball. Wow, Willie, that was impressive. What else can we do?
Special good morning to my wife, Rona, the love of my life.
Among their assembly of moss, bacteria, and moths, they carried a collection of tiny worms, hoping to determine the effects of gravity on cell organization. The 113th flight of the shuttle program initiated deorbit as planned. It was a routine journey home for the premier shuttle of the fleet.
Columbia flew the very first mission, the first space shuttle mission, and it flew 27 highly successful flights.
At 8:44 on the morning of February 1st, Columbia entered the Earth's atmosphere, 120 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean. The shuttle's descent would exceed the speed of sound, 24 times over.
So you get friction from your vehicle, your space shuttle, your craft, coming in. The friction of the atmosphere is rubbing really fast, causing a lot of heat. That's what's causing that burning up look.
Some plasma now.
Columbia was purpose-built to withstand the heat of re-entry, which reached an estimated 1,370 degrees Celsius. But something was wrong. Sensors on the left wing recorded strain, exceeding that of the shuttle's previous descents.
A number of alarms went off on board the vehicle that suggested that temperatures within the wheel wells of the undercarriage were being exceeded.
Then, the wing's sensors died, before Mission Control lost contact with the crew. Columbia's crew module completely depressurized before shredding to pieces only a minute later. There was no chance of survival. NASA's shuttle program had claimed another 7 lives.
When you get into Texas, there are multiple debris fields from the Dallas metro.
The trail of Columbia's carnage was strewn 400 kilometers across 3 American states. In order to solve the puzzle of how this tragedy occurred, the pieces needed to be recovered. In the months following Columbia's demise, thousands of volunteers joined one of the largest organized ground searches in history. The sense of shared duty to recover the shuttle exemplified the importance of the space program to the general public. As technicians at the Kennedy Space Center began sorting debris for reassembly, they made a startling discovery. A series of canisters containing the worms for biological study had survived impact. The worms, with an average life cycle of 8 days, were at least 4 generations descended from those launched aboard Columbia. As investigators began to reformulate pieces of the shuttle's wings, the key to the Columbia's demise slowly came to light. The roots of Columbia's tragic re-entry could be traced to the day of the shuttle's launch.
The extraordinary thing is that it was so simple what caused the problem. You know, a piece of insulation foam broke off during launch.
The main fuel tank of the space shuttles were filled with sub-zero liquid hydrogen and oxygen. Ice could often form outside, causing damage during takeoff.
There's a condition that's called the twang. And the twang is this entire stack and assembly will actually kind of move as much as 4 feet in some cases. And it's just responding to the energy that's coming out of the engines.
To prevent the buildup of ice, the tank was covered in thermal foam. But during Columbia's departure, a piece of this insulation broke off and struck the shuttle's wing.
A lot of people would say, well, wait a minute, you said foam. If I throw an empty styrofoam cup at you, you're not going to duck. It's a styrofoam cup. But if I take that styrofoam cup and I fill it with water and I freeze it, you still want me to throw it at you?
I believe that we have found the smoking gun. I believe that we've established that the foam block fell off of the external tank was in fact the most probable cause, the direct cause of the Columbia accident.
The foam had dislodged vital insulation tiles.
The structure of the space shuttle is actually similar to the structure of most modern aircraft. It's an aluminium frame, because that's a highly efficient way to build an aircraft. The difference with a space shuttle is aluminium gets very weak and loses stiffness when it gets hot, but the space shuttle protected that aluminium structure using its thermal protection system, using the space shuttle tiles.
The ceramic tiles were key to the concept of a reusable space shuttle.
Specially made ceramic-coated tiles mounted on the surface of the spacecraft make it possible for the shuttle to withstand repeated heating and cooling, up to 100 round-trip flights without replacement.
With just a small section of tiles missing, Columbia's re-entry was compromised. With an abscess in Columbia's left wing, the shuttle was exposed to extremely heated atmospheric gas, which pushed through into the craft. The superheated plasma built up in the wheel well, causing the wing to tear from the shuttle.
And of course, with the wing coming off, the vehicle becoming unstable, you just see the breakup of the spacecraft and scattering it over hundreds and hundreds of miles of Texas and Louisiana.
I think that was probably the nail in the coffin for the space shuttle program. I mean, sure, it was going to eventually be phased out, but you get 2 disasters in a row, and that's a serious thing for the public to have to deal with.
It was determined that the Columbia crew couldn't have fixed the problem, even if they were aware of it. Columbia demonstrated how perilous a routine re-entry could be, even for the leading space technology of the 2000s. But for the crew of Apollo 13, 33 years earlier, there were more hurdles to overcome before they could even attempt the same dangerous descent. As Apollo 13 limped out from the moon's shadow and radio contact was re-established, the world shared a collective sigh of relief.
The crew of Apollo 13.
But the problems were not yet over. The lunar module could never survive re-entry. The damaged command module, void of oxygen, could possibly make the return trip to Earth. But without being able to inspect the extent of the damage, there was no way of knowing if the heat shield was intact. Separating the service module from the rest of the craft, the astronauts got their first look at the extent of the damage.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. The whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. It's really a mess.
If the initial explosion had damaged the heat shield, the astronauts would burn up on re-entry. But it was their only option. The tension during those final minutes was enormous.
Odyssey, Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Astonishingly, the rescue of Apollo 13 was a brilliant success.
Apollo 13 is NASA's most successful failure.
The successful race to save the lives of Apollo 13's crew was a testament to NASA's planning and tough lessons learned in the past.
It probably was the disaster of Apollo 1 that actually led to the Apollo 13 success and the astronauts actually surviving that trip because they were so precautionary because of the Apollo 1 disaster.
It's one of the most extraordinary stories of rescue. I don't know of anyone that doesn't have a sense of pride in terms of the achievement of solving a serious problem like we had on Apollo 13 and rescuing that crew and bringing them back safely.
Great pleasure just to be back here on Earth, believe me.
Despite all the setbacks, humanity continues to explore space as technology, imagination, and endurance set new destinations.
We had people that couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. We knew every day was going to be more failures and more problems, but we were building towards something that no one had ever achieved.
Each new frontier to be conquered is filled with danger and risk.
Space is always pushing the bounds of what we need to do technology-wise, which means you have to deal with very dangerous stuff in a very controlled way. And as soon as something goes wrong, you end in a disaster.
But the human spirit to find purpose in new goals seems unquenchable. Out of the ashes of disasters past, a new aspiration is now on the horizon.
Just as people wanted to go to Antarctica, just as people want to go to the deepest parts of the ocean, we now want to go to Mars. And we will get there, and I'm excited to witness when that first human sets foot on Mars.